The image loaded frame by frame, the way it always does on a slow SD card in a truck that has been parked long enough that the battery voltage drops and the laptop draws power from a USB adapter taped to the dash. I was in the gravel pull-off above the Fish Creek trailhead on a Thursday morning in September, coffee going cold in the cup holder, running a routine pull from camera 7. The first 47 frames were expected. A mule deer doe crossing the game trail at 4 in the morning, her eyes 2 flat white discs in the infrared, 2 gray jays working a snag. A long run of empty frames as the motion trigger settled back down. Standard product of a month on camera 7. Deer. A pair of bull elk still in velvet, once the blurry flank of what I logged as probable black bear. Routine data from a routine camera in a drainage I had been working for 9 years. Frame 51. A man. Tan day pack, 2 trekking poles, blue jacket, moving east up the trail at a confident walking pace. He crossed the full width of the camera's field of view in 9 frames, about 30 seconds of walking time. Adult male, maybe mid-40s, moving well. He walked off the right edge of the frame, and I moved my cursor to the next image. Frame 62, the man was back in the shot. He was on the ground. I ran the next frame. Same position. Frame after that? Same. I was looking at someone who had gone down in open backcountry 3 miles from the trailhead with no other people and 9 months of camera footage from that site. I scrolled forward. He was still down at frame 70, still down at frame 85. I kept counting. At frame 93, a second subject entered the frame from the south tree line. I took my hand off the mouse. The coffee was cold. The engine ticked in the silence. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. We put these stories out every week, and the next one is worth being here for. My name is Dan Walker. I was 37 years old in September of 2008, and I was a wildlife biologist on the Lochsa Ranger District of the Clearwater National Forest in north-central Idaho. The technical job title was wildlife biologist. Out here, everyone who carries a Forest Service badge gets called a ranger, and I had stopped correcting people about 3 years into the job. I grew up in Kamaya, a town of 1,300 people, at the confluence of the Clearwater River and Lawyer Creek, 16 miles west of Kuskia, where the district office sits. My father ran a small logging operation out of Kamaya through the 70s and into the 80s, when the timber markets contracted and the millwork started following the timber to cheaper places. He shifted to contract road grading for the county when I was 12 and stayed at it until his hands gave out. My mother drove a school bus and grew tomatoes every summer in a garden behind the house that produced more than any 4 people could eat, and she gave the surplus away at the church and to whoever came down the road looking like they needed one. I spent every summer of my childhood in the timber and along the river, hunting grouse in the fir thickets above town, running set lines for catfish in the slack water below the Clearwater Falls, helping my father on the log decks when I was old enough to be useful and too young to be cautious. The landscape I knew as a child was the same landscape I came back to work as an adult. That probably made me a better biologist, and definitely made me a specific kind of person, the kind who thinks in drainages and ridge contours and seasonal cycles rather than in addresses and distances. My mother's family had been in this corner of Idaho since the 1890s. Homesteaders who came up the river when it was still territory and put roots down deep enough that 4 generations later, we still knew which ridgelines caught the morning light first and which creek bottoms held ice into April. That connection to the ground is not something you develop in a classroom. You absorb it through decades of walking the same drainages in every season until the country becomes a language you understand before you understand you know it. That was the person I was before the Forest Service, and it shaped everything about how I approach the work. There is a specific quality to the backcountry of the Lochsa drainage that I have never been able to describe well to people who have not been in it. The country is big, with a bigness that is not just acreage on a map. The ridges fold into each other, and the drainages run so deep and close together that you can stand on one ridge and hear a creek in the valley below you and another creek in the valley beyond that, and the sound of all that moving water fills the air even when there is no other sound. Highway 12 runs east from Kuskia, along the Lochsa River, and it is the only road through that section of the forest, a single paved line through otherwise unbroken timber, and on either side of it, the country goes back miles and miles into terrain that sees foot traffic only during hunting season and not always then. If you leave the road and walk into the side drainages, You are quickly in country where a person could be for a week without seeing another human, and where the distance to help, if you needed it, was measured in days rather than hours. I had spent 9 years learning to treat that remoteness as a working condition rather than a hazard, which is the adjustment that field biologists make, or they do not stay field biologists for long. I studied wildlife resources management at the University of Idaho in Moscow, graduated in 1994, worked 2 seasons as a wildlife technician on the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana, and came back to Idaho because that was where the country I wanted to work in actually was. The Lochsa District position opened in '99, and I had enough field time by then to compete for it. I had been in that piece of ground ever since. 9 years by the time this story starts. The Clearwater National Forest covers 1.8 million acres in the northern and central Idaho mountains, running from the Bitterroot Range on the Montana border westward into the forested slopes above the Clearwater River Canyon. The Lochsa Ranger District holds the southern portion, the stretch that U.S. Highway 12 threads through along the Lochsa River all the way east to Lolo Pass at the state line. The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness begins right to the south, one of the largest roadless areas in the lower 48 states. To the east, the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. The timber along the river bottom is western red cedar, massive old trees with layered fibrous bark and a sweet resin smell. I associate more with this country than with anywhere else on Earth.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Above the cedar zone, the forest grades into grand fir and Douglas fir, then lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce at higher elevations, with subalpine fir on the ridge tops. Western larch runs through all of it, the only deciduous conifer in the mix, the trees that turn a deep gold in October before they drop their needles and leave the ridgelines looking like something has burned through. My district office was in Kuskia, a town of 600 at the junction of the South Fork Clearwater and the main stem of the river. 30 miles east of Lewiston as the crow flies, and considerably longer by road through the canyon. The office managed forest activities across the Lochsa District, and in 2008, that was a staff of 11, the district ranger, the resource specialists, and the admin crew. Wildlife was me and a seasonal technician I had for 7 months of the year. The trail camera program on the Lochsa started in 2002. The trigger was wolf recovery. The central Idaho wolf reintroduction happened in '95. Wolves released into the Frank Church Wilderness, and from there they spread. By the early 2000s, the packs had established themselves in the Clearwater drainage, and the elk herd numbers were shifting in ways the biologists wanted to document more carefully. You cannot count wolves from the air the way you count elk, and you cannot collar every individual in a recovering population, so cameras became the primary tool for documenting which packs were using which territories and when. We started with 4 cameras in '02 and built to 12 over the following 3 years, positioning them at saddles, creek crossings, and ridge benches where game traffic concentrated. Camera 7 sat on a natural bench 3 miles up from the Fish Creek trailhead, at a spot where the trail crossed a secondary game corridor, a well-worn path that elk used between the north-facing slopes where they bedded and the open south-facing ground where they fed. The bench was flat enough that elk and deer used it rather than the steeper routes above and below, and the game trail crossing it was packed down by years of ungulate traffic. I had mounted Camera 7 in early spring of 2007, set into an old-growth western red cedar at 42 inches off the ground, aimed east along the trail. In the first 14 months of operation, Camera 7 gave me 4 confirmed wolf passes, one of them an entire pack of 9, moving through single file at 3 in the morning. 17 elk in documented groups, 40 deer, roughly, 4 black bears, a wolverine in January of 2008, which caught my attention because wolverines in the Clearwater are not common and any confirmed individual is worth logging carefully. A moose cow in March, working the cedar bottom below the bench. And starting in the summer of 2008, 3 images I could not log under any category the district camera program used. The first anomalous image on Camera 7 came in June. I was pulling the card for the quarterly wildlife summary, loading images on the district laptop the same way I did every cycle. And image 216 showed movement through the frame from south to north, perpendicular to the trail. at 11:47 in the evening. The infrared captured it in the same washed-out glow it caught everything else in, and what I was looking at was vertical, clearly upright, clearly moving on two legs, large enough that the upper torso filled most of the frame from waist height upward, which told me it was somewhere in the range of 6.5 to 7 feet tall based on the camera's mounting height. The image was motion blurred, moving faster than the deer I typically photographed at that location, fast enough to blur the edges. But the silhouette was there, wide through the chest and shoulders, arms that looked long relative to the torso, no pack, no equipment, no reflective gear of any kind. I logged it as UBI, unidentified bipedal individual, which is not an official Forest Service designation. It is what I called them in my personal notes when I could not determine whether an image was a person or some kind of motion artifact. I had seen 2 or 3 UBIs over the years before this, always out of focus, always ambiguous enough to write off. I wrote this one off the same way. A note in the camera log. Move on. The second anomalous image came in August. Camera 3. Up in the Warm Springs drainage 2 miles north of the Lochsa. Same time of night, same general silhouette, the same motion blur problem. But this one was sharper. Sharp enough to see the arms clearly, and the arms were not proportioned like a person's arms. They were longer, reaching past what would have been the hip line of a human standing that height. The right hand was caught in mid-swing, and the hand was large. Noticeably large. The fingers appeared to be long and thick, and they were catching the infrared beam differently than exposed skin normally does, as if something covered the hand other than skin. I pulled that image off the card separately and saved it on my personal laptop, not the district machine. I did not know exactly why I made that choice at the time. Professional habit, maybe? You do not put information into the official system until you know what you have. The third anomalous image was the week before the seizure, August 31st, Camera 9, on a ridge above Pete King Creek, 4 miles east of Camera 7. This one was the clearest of the 3. Taken at 6:42 in the morning, which meant there was natural light, the early gray before sunrise that gives the cameras better resolution than infrared alone. The subject was standing at the far left edge of the frame, partially behind a lodgepole pine. And what I was looking at was not a person, and was not a bear, and was not any of the other explanations I had been using. The body was covered in dense hair, dark, a deep charcoal brown that the morning light picked up without ambiguity. The face was turned partly toward the camera. The brow was heavy, the nose broad and flat, the jaw heavier than a human jaw. And the eyes, and I want to be precise about this, the eyes were looking at the camera, not toward it, at it, with the specific directed attention of something that understood what a box mounted to a tree was, or at minimum understood that it was worth looking at. I did not sleep much the night I processed that image. I sat at my kitchen table in Kuskia with a glass of water and looked at the laptop screen for a long time, and I thought about what I was going to do with it, and I did not come to any conclusion. I went to bed at midnight and lay there until 2:30, and then got up and drove to the office because I could not be still. So that was the context when Camera 7 gave me frame 62 on September 4th, 2008, and the man in the blue jacket and the trekking poles who walked into my frame and did not walk out of it. I ran the frames from the beginning again after I saw him on the ground. The doe at 4 in the morning, the gray jays, the empty trail, then him, walking east at a confident pace. Confident enough that I had no reason to look twice when he first crossed the frame. Then the gap, then frame 62. If you have not seen a tonic-clonic seizure, the still image version is difficult to interpret at first. A fall looks like a fall. You can read the physics of it in how the body lands. What I was looking at in frame 62 was different. Both arms were rigid, locked at angles no falling person holds. The legs were straight. The back was arched slightly. His face was turned away from the camera, but I could see the side of his jaw and the way his neck was taut, and it was not the tension of effort. It was the tension of a body that had stopped being in someone's control. I sat there for a few seconds. Then I ran the subsequent frames. The tonic phase held for several frames, that full body rigidity, and then the clonic phase began. The rhythmic, convulsing, and by the timestamp it ran for just over 2 minutes before it started to ease. In the frames after the convulsions stopped, he lay on his side on the trail, still, and I could read the difference between the locked unconsciousness of the seizure and the exhausted slack of the body coming down from it. He was alone. No second pack in any frame, no hiking companion jogging back into the shot from up the trail. Whatever was happening to this man was happening to him by himself. 3 miles from the trailhead, on a bench above Fish Creek where the nearest person was me, a mile down the valley in a truck with a fogged laptop screen. Frame 91, empty trail. He was still on the ground, but had slid out of frame. The camera's field of view was narrow, 20 feet across at that distance, and he had been lying at the far right edge when the convulsions stopped. Frame 92, empty trail. Frame 93, movement. Not from the trail, from the south tree line at the far left edge of the frame. The trees down there were dense, second growth grand fir and western red cedar dropping off into the creek bottom, and what came out of them was dark and large, and it moved into the left edge of the frame slowly, too slowly for the mass it appeared to carry. Elk move with a decisive purpose when they commit to crossing open ground. Bears commit to a direction. This was unhurried with the patience of something that had already decided. It crossed the camera's field of view from left to right across 4 frames, 4 motion trigger activations spaced at 5-second intervals, and it stopped beside the man. I ran those 4 frames a dozen times before I put the truck in drive. What I saw, clearly, in September morning light at 7:43 on a game trail in the Clearwater National Forest, where a trail camera does not lie and motion blur is not an excuse. Something over 7 feet tall, covered in dense dark hair, with arms that hung well past the midpoint of the thigh when it stood straight, crossed 20 feet of open game trail and crouched beside an unconscious man and stayed. It did not sniff him. It did not investigate the way a bear investigates, with the methodical, nose-forward attention of an animal assessing food. It lowered itself beside him, and the crouch alone told me about how its hips and knees were structured, because it moved down into position the way a large person kneels, not the way a quadruped drops. And it settled. One large hand, the right, came down flat on the ground beside the man's shoulder. Not on him, beside him. It was in that position through the next 19 frames. 19 motion trigger captures. At minimum, 90 seconds. Probably more, because if neither of them was moving, the trigger would extend those intervals. Whatever the exact duration, it was there, sitting beside a man it did not know, on a trail it apparently used regularly enough to have appeared on 3 of my cameras over the summer, doing nothing except staying. I do not have language for what that is. I have been doing wildlife work long enough that I have seen animal behavior that surprised me. Wolves cooperating in ways the textbooks barely covered. Bears caching food with a deliberateness that implied planning. That wolverine in January carrying a carcass twice its own weight up a 40-degree slope. But I had never seen anything choose to stay beside something hurt. Not once. Every species I had ever documented did one of 2 things when it encountered distress. It avoided the situation, or it took advantage of it. This was neither of those things. Frame 112. The man's right hand moved, came up slightly off the ground and dropped. The beginning of the postictal return, muscles starting to take orders again, the brain coming back online, a reflex motion, not conscious. Frame 113. The thing beside him shifted, not away, sat up straighter, pulled back about a foot, but did not get up and did not leave. I watched it look at the man's hand for 2 frames, 3 frames, with an attention that was different from the baseline stillness of the previous 90 seconds. The head angled down, the body changed posture, and in frame 115, in September morning light, I could see the face. Wide, the features heavy, a pronounced brow ridge, deep-set brown eyes, a flat, broad nose, a jaw more substantial than any human jaw I had looked at. The hair on the face was sparser than on the body, and the skin showing through, around the jaw and cheeks and the area below the eyes, was a dark gray-brown, the color of old leather that has been outside for a long time. And the eyes, which I could see clearly in that frame, were not looking at the camera. They were looking at the man beside them. Whatever I might have wanted to see in an expression like that, I will not project. I will only say what the frame showed. Something had come out of the timber to be beside a person who was hurt, and it was looking at him with the full attention of a being that was not going anywhere. I closed the laptop, opened it, ran frame 115 one more time. Then I called the district office on the radio, told my colleague Rita I was heading to Camera 7's location on a possible welfare check, hiker possibly down on the Fish Creek Trail, and to log it and call, search, and rescue if she did not hear from me by noon. Rita said, "Copy that." I put the truck in drive. The Fish Creek Trailhead is 22 miles from the Kuskia office, by my usual route, 12 of it paved on Highway 12, and the rest on a gravel forest road that requires either slow driving or a good shock absorber budget. I drove as fast as I could manage without putting the truck in the ditch. The camera timestamps told me the man had been in the postictal state from 7:45 onward. The motion trigger stopped capturing at 8:07, which meant either everyone had left the camera's field of view by then or there had been no movement to trigger for. It was 8:22 when I left the pull-off. If his recovery was going normally, he would be conscious and confused by now, beginning to understand that he was on a trail in the woods and was not sure how he had gotten from standing to the ground. If it was not going normally, I needed to be moving faster than I was. I parked at the trailhead at 8:49, grabbed the first aid kit from the truck bed, slung the day pack with the AED unit the district had issued us the year before, and I started up the trail at the fastest pace I had run in 3 or 4 years. My knees let me know about it at the first quarter mile and kept the commentary going all the way to the bench. 3 miles at that pace is about 45 minutes on that terrain. 45 minutes is a long time when you do not know what you are going to find at the other end. The trail climbed from the creek bottom through a mixed stand of Douglas fir and grand fir, crossing 2 small drainages on log bridges the trail crew had put in during the summer. The understory was open, the big firs shadowing out most of the shrubs, and the September morning light was coming through the canopy at a low angle from the east, slanted and gold, and filtered through a million individual needles. The air smelled like cold water and fir resin and the first edge of autumn duff, that smell that happens when the summer heat lifts and the leaves begin to break down and the forest starts composting itself for winter. I heard him before I saw him, coughing. The specific labored cough of someone who has been on their back for a while and is working moisture back into their throat. I came around the last switchback before the bench, and he was sitting up, leaning against a lodgepole pine at the edge of the trail, his pack behind him, trekking poles lying crossed in the duff a few feet away. He was maybe 45, brown hair going gray at the temples, a week of beard, the kind of weathered face that comes from spending a lot of time at elevation. He had a trail map unfolded across his knees that I do not think he was actually reading. When he heard my boots on the trail, he looked up with an expression that combined confusion and relief in the specific proportions of someone who does not know how bad things just were, but can read it in the other person's face. "You with the Forest Service?" he said. "Wildlife biologist, Lochsa District," I said. "Dan Walker, are you hurt?" He looked at his hands, turned them over. The palms were scraped and dirty from the fall. "I don't think so. I don't know what happened. I was walking, and then I was on the ground, and I don't know how long." I crouched beside him and went through the standard field assessment. Pupil response, bilateral grip, track my finger, what is your name, what day is it, what year. His name was Roy Galloway. He was from Camilla, same town I grew up in, though I did not recognize him. It was Thursday, September 4th, 2008. He passed all of it with the slightly delayed precision of someone whose brain has just rebooted after a hard crash. "What do you remember last?" I asked. "I was walking and I was looking at some bear grass at the side of the trail, and then it's you. There's nothing in between. How long have you been sitting here?" "I don't know. A while. I had to figure out where I was." He looked at his palms again. I hit the back of my head. "That's going to be a bruise." He touched the back of his head carefully. A small knot forming above the occipital, no laceration I could feel through his hair. The ground where he had been lying was soft duff with no exposed rock nearby. "Did you bite your tongue?" He stopped, worked his jaw. "Yeah, some." "Do you have a history of seizures?" The look on his face said everything before he did. It was the look of someone who knows exactly what the question means and has been hoping to never have reason to hear it again. "I had one when I was 17, he said. 1983. They put me on Delanton for about 5 years. The seizure stopped, and the doctor took me off in 89. I've been clear for 19 years. Today wasn't clear." "No," he looked at his hands again. "I suppose today wasn't clear." We sat on the bench for a minute. A Steller's jay landed in the fir above us and worked the branches with the shameless industry of a bird that considers the forest its personal property. The creek below the bench was audible, the low, constant murmur of water over late summer cobble, My truck is at the trailhead, Roy said. I drove myself up from Kamaya this morning. Got here around 6:30. He stopped. I can't drive home. No, I'll drive you to Clearwater Valley Hospital in Orofino when we get back. They'll run you through neurology and call your family. He looked like he was going to argue, and then he didn't. Yeah, okay. I'll call Brenda from the truck. I helped him collect his gear, and we started back down the trail, moving slow. The first aid kit stayed in my pack. The AED stayed in my pack. By the time we crossed the first log bridge over the creek drainage, about 20 minutes into the walk, Roy was moving steadily on his own, and his speech was cleaner, and he was asking me questions about the trail camera program, which told me his cognition was returning at a normal rate. Here's what I was carrying in my head while we walked. 90 seconds, 19 frames, a hand on the ground between a man and an edge he did not know was behind him. I had not decided yet what to tell Roy. I thought about it for most of the walk down. What I kept coming back to was a question I had no business asking professionally, but could not stop asking personally. If I had been lying on that trail, if I had been the one who went down and did not know it, what would I want someone to tell me? The answer was not complicated. I would want to know. By the time we reached the trailhead, I had made up my mind. I got Roy situated in the passenger seat with his pack in the bed. He called his wife Brenda on my truck's radio, no cell signal at the trailhead, and told her he'd had a spell and he was fine, and he'd explain when he got home. She asked if he needed her to drive to Orofino, and he said no. He had the Forest Service biologist with him, and she said okay, in a tone that told me she knew him well enough to fill in the gaps he was leaving out. Before I take you to Orofino, I said, I need to show you something. I opened the laptop on the seat between us and ran the frames from the beginning. Roy watched the doe, the gray jays, himself walking up the trail, moving well, trekking poles, swinging, then the gap, then frame 62. That's a seizure, he said. Yes. I've never seen one from the outside. No. He watched himself on the ground. The tonic phase, the clonic phase, the postictal stillness. The expression on his face was not what I expected. It was not shock. It was a quieter thing. The look of someone seeing confirmation of something they had always been somewhat afraid was still possible. You wanted to show me that so I understand how serious this is, he said. I understand. I won't hike alone again without someone. Roy, I said, keep watching. Frame 91, 92, 93. The south tree line, the left edge of the frame, the beginning of the movement. Roy did not say anything. He leaned forward slightly and he watched. I let all the frames run. The crossing, the crouch, the hand on the ground. 19 frames of stillness. The shift when Roy's hand moved. Frame 115. The face turned toward Roy with that full attention. When the images stopped, Roy sat back and put both hands flat on his thighs and looked at the dashboard and then at the windshield and then at the trees at the edge of the trailhead parking area, which were ordinary trees, grand fir, and some alder along the drainage, standing in the September morning doing nothing except being trees. He looked at them for a long time. What is that? He said. Not a question asked in the usual way. The syntax of a question with no expectation of an answer from outside himself. I don't know exactly, I said. I've been picking up anomalous images on several of my cameras since June. That's the clearest one I have. It stayed with me. Yes. For how long? 90 seconds minimum from the frames. Probably more. The motion trigger stops capturing if nothing is moving. Why did it? He stopped, started again. Why would something do that? I did not have an answer. I still do not have a complete answer, though I have spent 16 years turning the question over. Does this go in your report? Roy asked. I haven't decided. He nodded. He looked at the tree line one more time. When he turned back to me, he had an expression I recognized from people who have been through something that outpaces their existing framework and are in the early stages of building a new one. You've been seeing it on cameras since June, he said. You didn't report it then. No. What stopped you? Same thing that's stopping me now. He thought about that for a moment. Okay, he said. Take me to Orofino. I took him to Clearwater Valley Hospital in Orofino. The emergency department ran the standard post-seizure workup, blood panel, CT scan of the head, neurological assessment, no structural abnormality on the CT. The attending physician put him back on levetiracetam and referred him to a neurologist at Street, Joseph Regional Medical Center in Lewiston for follow-up monitoring. Roy called Brenda from the hospital this time with an actual phone, and she drove down from Kamaya and met him there. Her name was Brenda Galloway. She was a small woman with short, gray-streaked hair and sharp blue eyes, and the contained, practical energy of someone who has been managing difficult situations for a long time without requiring drama from the process. She shook my hand at the hospital entrance and held it for an extra second before letting go, and that was the only acknowledgement she made of what I had done that morning. Some things do not fit into words without getting smaller in the translation. I drove back to Kuskia, collected Roy's truck from the trailhead that evening and left it in the hospital parking lot in Orofino so Brenda could get him home easily. On the drive back to Kuskia, I thought about frame 115 again. Not the face in that frame, which I had already spent hours thinking about. The hand, the right hand, placed flat on the ground beside Roy's shoulder. I had been focused on what the hand meant about the intent to stay, but on the fifth or sixth time through the frame, there was something else. The hand was not placed randomly on the trail surface. It was placed on the south side of Roy's body, between Roy's shoulder and the south edge of the bench, which fell away steeply toward the Fish Creek drainage below, not between Roy and the tree line, between Roy and the drop. Whatever was crouching beside him knew which direction the ground fell away. I thought about that for the rest of the drive, and I was still thinking about it when I got home. I went back to the bench 4 days later, not to pull a card. I went to walk the ground and think on it, and to see what the area looked like from inside rather than from the camera's fixed angle. September in the Clearwater is the last warmth before the October cold moves off the Bitterroots, and the western larch starts turning, and the elk season opens, and the backcountry changes its character entirely. The timber was still green, but the understory ferns were beginning to bronze, and the creek was dropping, exposed rock along the banks that had been underwater in June. The air had that September quality, drier than summer, sharper, with a faint smoke edge from a fire somewhere to the east that I had not gotten a precise location on. I walked the bench first. The spot where Roy had been lying was marked by a scuff in the trail surface where his poles had fallen, and a slight compression in the duff where his pack had rested. I stood at the south edge of the bench and looked at the drop. 3.5 feet to the first ledge, then a steeper pitch down to the creek bottom. Not a lethal fall in most conditions, but a fall that could send a postictal man sliding into a rock face below. A fall that could have turned a difficult morning into a morning that ended differently. I stood at the edge and looked at the south tree line. Dense second-growth cedar and grand fir, the understory full of sword, fern, and vine maple, timber that takes things in and leaves no sign of their passage. I stood there for 5 minutes, and the timber stood back and did not give me anything. The birds had been busy when I arrived. A red-tailed hawk calling from above the ridge, a flock of Clark's nutcrackers moving through the lodge poles to the east. By the time I had been standing at the tree line for a few minutes, they had settled back into their ordinary work. A Steller's jay was dissecting a pine cone in the cedar above me, dropping scales on the ground. The creek below the bench murmured over late summer gravel. The musk came in from the south. I have been around enough large mammals to know musk as a category of scent: bear musk, elk musk, the sharp alkaline marking of a beaver. This did not belong to any of those categories. It was heavier, warmer, with a layered quality, not one note but several stacked beneath each other, and the top note had a sweetness to it that did not belong to the cedar and fir background. It came in on a shift of air from the tree line, and then it was simply present. Filling the space, the sound of a river fills a valley, fully and from all sides at once. I stood still. The Steller's jay stopped working the pine cone. The hawk had gone quiet or moved off. The creek was still there because the creek is always there, but everything else had gone quiet in the gradual, voluntary way the forest quiets when something changes in it. The musk intensified. Whatever was producing it was closer. Or the air had shifted, or both. I did not turn around. Part of my training said to turn, to face a potential threat, to control the situation. But the musk was not a threat smell. There was nothing in it that made my back go up the way a bear smell does when the bear is close and aware of you. And the quiet the forest had settled into was not the alarmed quiet of prey species detecting a predator. It was the held quality of everything, waiting for something to finish happening at its own pace. It came around the left side of my field of view, moving from the south tree line toward the bench, not from behind me, walking, on 2 feet, with a stride longer than mine and heavier, the kind of weight that September duff registers differently than deer or elk, pressing the soil rather than marking it. I let it come into my peripheral vision before I turned my head. Then I turned, slowly. 7 feet and some, dark hair, a deep charcoal brown on the back and shoulders that caught the morning light and went darker in the shadow of the lower body, with a warm undertone on the forearms where the hair thinned and the skin showed through, a gray-brown like ponderosa bark after a century of weather. The arms were long, longer than the proportions of a human body would produce at this height, hanging loose and open at the sides. The hands were open, not reaching, not displaying, open. The face. The face was the face from frame 115, and seeing it in full light at 30 feet rather than on a laptop screen was a different thing. The brow ridge threw a shadow over the eyes, but the eyes were visible, brown and deep-set, and they found me without searching. It had known where I was standing. It had known for a while, I think, the same way it had known where Roy was on that bench and where the ground dropped away south of him. We stood on that bench for close to 4 minutes. The creek talked below. The ferns in the understory moved in a slight draw of air. The sky above the canopy was deep blue, that North Idaho September blue that comes when the summer haze clears and the high-pressure air moves in and everything goes sharp and clean and cold at the edges. In those 4 minutes, I did what biologists do, which is observe. I made myself look at the details, even when the details were difficult to hold. The height, measured against the lodgepole pines behind it, whose diameters I had logged. The arm-to-torso ratio, longer than human proportions allow. The chest, broad and deep, rising and falling with breathing that I could see but not hear at 30 feet. The hair dense on the back and shoulders and thinning at the chest where the skin showed through, darker than the hair and carrying a faint sheen in the September light. The hands, large enough that I could see their scale from where I stood, the fingers thick and the palms wide, and the face turned toward me with an attention I can only describe as complete. Not the darting, flicking assessment of a prey animal, not the casual survey of a predator checking a cleared area. Something sitting with a decision it had already made. I thought about frame 93 while I stood there. The way it had come across the open ground, not toward me but toward Roy, moving with that particular unhurried certainty, crossing 20 feet of clear trail without any hesitation. It had known what it was going to do before it did it. And here, 30 feet from me on a bench in September, it had that same quality. It knew what it was doing. Standing, letting me look, not requiring anything from the exchange, except that I be present for it. It turned away first. Not with haste. Without haste. It turned its body and walked to the south tree line, and the timber took it the way a river takes in rain, completely, without trace, and the Steller's jay immediately went back to the pine cone, and the hawk called from the east ridge, and the forest returned to the version of itself it had been when I arrived. I sat down on the bench. My legs wanted to, and I let them. I looked at the tree line. I looked at the scuff where Roy's poles had landed. I looked at the drop-off in the creek below. 4 minutes on a bench in the Clearwater National Forest, and everything my training said to do with that kind of encounter, document it, report it, enter it into the chain of information that moves from field observations to district summaries to regional reviews, was in direct opposition to everything I had felt during those 4 minutes, which was that I was in the presence of something that had made a deliberate decision to be there and to let me see it, and that the decision had been made for reasons I was not yet equipped to understand. I went back to the truck and wrote 3 pages in my field notebook. Then I closed the notebook and drove to Kuskia. That evening, I copied the 3 anomalous images off the district laptop onto a personal external drive. Then I deleted them from the quarterly card data before I filed the summary. The full September 4th frame sequence went the same way. Personal drive off the district system. I told myself I was protecting an ongoing behavioral observation. That was true enough to let me sleep for a while. I kept going to the bench through September and into October. Not every visit produced anything I could log, even in the private notes. Some mornings I sat on a fallen log at the north edge and watched the tree line for an hour, and the forest went about its ordinary business, and I hiked back down and did the rest of my work. But one morning in 3, sometimes more, the musk came in, and the birds stepped back from whatever they were doing, and the presence settled somewhere in the south tree line. That peripheral awareness of something large and watching at the edge of things, and then it would ease, and the ordinary sounds would return. On October 15th, the first morning of the general elk rifle season, I went up to the bench before first light, 4 in the morning, headlamp on, the trail still dark under the fir canopy, frost on the duff where the cold had gotten into the open spots. I sat on the log and waited for the light to come. 3 bull elk crossed the bench from west to east at first light, moving at an unhurried walk, their antlers carrying a rime of frost along the main beams. They passed within 40 yards of me and paid me no attention, which meant I had managed the wind and the stillness. I watched them move east into the timber, and then the bench was empty again. After they were gone, working the south edge of the bench looking for sign, I found the prints. On a small patch of bare soil that the October frost had preserved in some detail, pressed into the ground by weight rather than thawed into it, there were 2 impressions. Both feet, full footprints from heel to toe, clearly defined. The stride between them was about 50 inches. I crouched over them and looked for a long time before I took out the tape measure. Length, 16 3/4 inches. Width across the ball of the foot, 7 1/8. Depth, a little over 1 1/4 inches in frozen soil, which implied a weight well above anything the elk or deer I had been tracking for years would produce at this soil temperature. I photographed them with my personal camera. Then I mixed plaster from the kit I had started carrying up the trail in October, poured both casts, let them set for 45 minutes in the cold, lifted them carefully and wrapped them in a flannel shirt from my pack, carried them down the 3 miles to the truck in my arms, laid them on the seat beside me. They are on a shelf in my garage in Kamaya, next to a box of fishing gear and a plastic bin of elk camp supplies. I have shown them to 2 people in 16 years. Roy Galloway is one of them. Roy called me in February of 2009. His neurologist at Street, Joseph in Lewiston, had cleared him for normal physical activity once the levetiracetam levels were established and stable, no breakthrough events in 5 months. He asked if I would take him back to the camera location the following spring. Not because he wanted to do anything with what he had seen on that laptop screen, not to file anything or tell anyone or take anything with him when he left. He said he wanted to sit on that bench and be in the place where it happened and understand what he could of it. We went in early May of 2009. The western larch were coming out in their first week of needles. That brilliant yellow-green that is different from the green of any other tree in the Clearwater, more luminous, almost lit from inside, and the creek was loud with snowmelt, running higher and faster than I had seen it in September. We hiked in together in about an hour and sat on the log at the north edge of the bench. I had brought the laptop. I ran the frames again, there on the bench where they had been captured, with the actual tree line visible from where we were sitting and the actual scale of the ground in front of us to measure what we were seeing on screen against. "Look at where the hand is," I said when we reached frame 115. "Look at where the south edge is behind you in this image." Roy looked at the screen and then at the edge of the bench to the south, the drop toward the Fish Creek drainage, and then back at the screen. He studied it for a long time. "It's between me and the drop," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a while. A pair of American dippers were working the creek below the bench, bobbing and diving into the snowmelt water the way they do in May, indifferent to the temperature. The firs above us were dripping from the previous night's rain. "That's a choice," Roy said. "That placement is a choice." "That's what I think." He looked at the south tree line. The cedar and fir down at the creek were dense and dark, holding the shadows longer than the open bench in the early morning light. He looked at it for a long time, and the tree line looked back at him without giving him anything. "Do you think it's still in this area?" he asked. "The cameras have kept picking up anomalous sign on the ridges north and south of here. When I'm up here, the forest goes quiet before I leave. Something is paying attention to this spot." Roy nodded. He leaned back against the log and looked up at the new fir growth on the tips of the branches overhead, that first week green. He was quiet for so long I thought he might have drifted off. Then he said, "I had a conversation with the neurologist about what causes a breakthrough seizure after 19 years of clear. She said physiological stress is the most common precipitant, especially in adult onset recurrence. I had been running some stress that summer." He paused. "Work trouble. A disagreement with Brenda that I won't get into. I came up here alone because I needed to be somewhere that was just the ground and the trees and me, and I pushed the pace on the hike in and my blood sugar probably dropped, and all of it stacked up and my brain had had enough. Okay, what I mean is that I didn't collapse because of anything in these woods. I collapsed because of things I was carrying before I got here, and what was in the woods stayed with me anyway. Yes. He looked at the tree line one more time. Then he picked up a small piece of bark from the log beside him, turned it over in his hands a few times, and set it back down. I'm not going to tell Brenda the specific parts, he said. She'd worry about something she can't do anything about, and that's not fair to either of us. That's your call. What are you going to do with the footage? Nothing that puts it into a system. He nodded, slow. Good. He got up from the log and brushed bark off his jacket. Let's head back. We went down the trail in the May morning, past the log bridges and the alder bottoms and the big firs, and we did not talk much. At the trailhead, he shook my hand and said, "Thank you for going back up there that day." I told him it was part of the job. He said, "No, it wasn't," and he was right. The summer of 2009 was when my relationship to the bench changed from observation to something I do not have a professional category for. I had been up there enough times that the visits had their own rhythm. The drive in on the gravel road, the 3-mile hike, the hour or two on the log, the drive back. The official camera pulls were part of the rotation, and I handled them the same way I always had, just with more care about what left the district system and what stayed on the personal drive. The behavioral notes I was keeping grew more specific through that summer. I went up to the bench with a single question in mind for each visit, trying not to approach the observations the way a person approaches a puzzle, trying to force a conclusion, but the way you watch a drainage across 3 seasons and let the picture assemble itself. The gate was one focus. On a morning in late June, I arrived before first light and stayed still on the log until the light came in and the temperature rose and the duff dried out and then the musk came. It crossed the open bench twice that morning, moving between the south and north tree lines, and I could watch the full stride. The movement was nearly silent for the mass involved, which had to do with how weight moved through the foot. The prints I had cast in October showed a full foot contact pattern rather than the heel strike gait that humans use, the entire foot surface landing at once, distributing impact across a larger area, producing less sound. The stride was long but unhurried. It covered ground without looking like it was trying to cover ground. I thought of elk moving through timber, that same quality of size and speed together that does not look like effort from the outside. The hands were another focus. I came back to the hands consistently because hands tell you more about what a thing does in the world than almost any other feature. On an October morning in 2009, I watched from the log while it stood at the south edge of the bench and worked with a piece of western red cedar bark it had picked up from the ground. It held the bark with both hands and folded it in half, then folded it again, then set the folded piece back on the log it had come from, not building anything, not eating. The kind of manipulation a person does when their hands are moving while their attention is elsewhere, absent and purposeful at the same time. Expression was harder. I came at it carefully because projecting emotion onto a face with different underlying structure is a way to make yourself see what you want to see. The brow ridge changed how light fell on the eyes. The jaw geometry was different. The musculature around the mouth did not produce the same range of motion a human face produces. I tried to read only what the eyes gave me, because eyes are eyes regardless of what surrounds them. What I read, over 2 years of visits, was not static. Attention, most often, a focused awareness that did not feel passive. Curiosity on several occasions, a slight forward lean of the head and body that I associated with my saying or doing something outside the expected routine. Patience on the mornings I stayed quiet and still for a long time. And once, in February of 2010, a cold morning when I had hiked up in 6 inches of fresh snow and sat on the bench for 2 hours in the gray overcast before anything happened, when it finally came to the tree line and settled there, I watched something change in the body's posture and in the set of the eyes that I am going to call relief. I know that word carries implications I cannot fully support. I use it anyway because it is the most accurate word I have for what I saw when it found me on the log where I always was. Winter changed the bench in ways that added a different layer to the observations. When the snowpack came in, usually in November in the Fish Creek drainage, the trail became inaccessible without snowshoes, and the 3-mile hike took twice as long as it did in September. But I kept going. Into December, when the days were short and the temperatures dropped to single digits, and the firs carried snow loads that occasionally cracked a branch somewhere in the canopy with a sound like a rifle shot in the frozen quiet. On those winter mornings, the bench was a different place. The creek noise was muffled under ice at the edges, and the forest had that specific cold stillness that the boreal country produces in January when the moisture in the air is locked and nothing moves and the sound of your own breathing seems too loud. What I found on those winter visits, consistently, was sign in the snow around the bench that told me the bench was used whether I was there or not. Not footprints exactly, because the top snow would drift and soften the impressions, but compressions, packed areas in the duff under the overhanging firs on the south side where the snow was not as deep, areas that held warmth longer than the surrounding ground, that had the specific pressed quality of a place something had rested. I photographed these whenever I found them, and I mapped their positions over 3 winters, and the pattern that emerged was consistent. The south side of the bench, sheltered by the big firs, with a clear line of sight to the north side where I came from. It had a view of the approach. Whatever used the south side of that bench could watch the trail from the north without being visible from it. By the fall of 2010, I had 4 notebooks of field observations, a growing archive of images on the personal drive from both the bench cameras and from 2 personal cameras I had started keeping off the official system, and 6 plaster casts from various locations around the bench and the adjacent ridges. I had no colleagues in this. I had Roy, who called twice a year and came up to the bench with me once each summer, sitting on the north log and quiet while we watched the tree line together. I had the work itself. I had the drive back to Kuskia in the late morning and the notebooks in the evenings and the questions I was not getting closer to answering, but at least getting more precise about asking. 2 things happened in the fall of 2010 that pushed those questions from background to front. The first was a wildlife biologist from the Northern Region office in Missoula who came through the Lochsa District in October to review ungulate monitoring data. Her name was Donna Forsyth. She was systematic, which was her reputation and also the reality. She ran camera data summaries end to end, and she noticed discrepancies. "You have a 3-week data gap on camera 3 from August of '08, she said. We were in the district conference room with the quarterly summaries spread across the table, and camera 7 is missing a full quarterly summary from that same period. I had been careful. The gaps were small, the kind that typically get attributed to equipment failure or corrupted cards without anyone pulling the original field logs to verify. But Donna was pulling the field logs. Card corruption, I said. Both cameras, same summer. I logged it at the time. I had not logged it. She looked at me for a moment with the specific neutral expression of someone who is deciding how much of what she is thinking to say. I'll put it in the review as equipment failure, she said. But you should think about upgrading the card readers. 2 corruptions on different cameras in one summer suggests a reader issue rather than card manufacture. I'll put in the request, I said. She moved on. I got through the rest of the review without another question about it. That evening, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in the district office and thought about what kind of person I was trying to be in this work and whether the answer I kept coming to was the right one. I had been a biologist for 11 years. My job was to document, to report, to contribute accurate information to the systems that managed the forest. I was doing none of those things with the most significant data I had ever collected in my career. I thought about what reporting would produce, and I went through it carefully. The way you work a problem when you want to make sure you are not just rationalizing. A report would generate an investigation would generate a deployment. Biologists, possibly law enforcement, cameras, hair traps, potentially helicopters, and ground teams. Whatever was living in that bench area and using the Fish Creek corridor would leave. Not because it was unintelligent, because it was intelligent enough to understand that concentrated human attention was something to move away from. Everything I had observed over 2 years told me that. The same awareness that had allowed it to come within 30 feet of me on a quiet morning was the awareness that would read an investigation team as a completely different kind of presence and respond accordingly. Reporting it meant losing it. Protecting it meant silence. I had made this calculation before. I kept making it. The answer kept coming out the same. The second thing that happened in the fall of 2010 was the elk calf data. Carol Donaldson, the district wildlife manager and the biologist I respected more than anyone else I had worked with in my career, had been running a long-term study on elk calf survival in the Lochsa District. She marked calves each spring with radio ear tags and tracked survival through the following spring. In October, she came to me with her 3rd year of mortality data and said, "Look at this one section." Her mortality map showed calf deaths across the district through the summer and fall, coded by cause: wolf predation, mountain lion, bear, vehicle, unknown. In the Fish Creek drainage, the calf mortality rate was lower than anywhere else in the district, significantly lower. The calves that moved into the Fish Creek corridor in spring were surviving at a rate roughly 20% higher than calves in comparable habitat elsewhere on the Lochsa. Predation pressure should be similar down there, Carol said. The wolf pack data doesn't show reduced activity in that corridor. Lion survey is consistent across the district. I can't account for the differential. I could account for it. I sat with that number for a week. 20%. I thought about the October morning I had watched something move between the south and north tree lines with that unhurried efficiency, and about the morning in late August the previous year when I had seen it cross the bench at a pace I would describe as purposeful, heading north, and about 30 seconds later heard 2 elk cows crashing through the timber to the north, moving away from the bench, away from whatever had crossed it. I did not tell Carol what I thought was driving the differential. I told her I had been running some informal behavioral observations in the Fish Creek drainage that might be relevant and that I would like to write them up as a district technical report when I had enough data. She said more information is always useful and asked when I expected to have something on paper. I said I needed another year. She said take 2. I spent 2 more years writing a report I was never going to submit. I went to the bench. I filled notebooks. I had Roy come up with me in May of 2011 and May of 2012. Brenda came the second time. She sat on the north log in silence for 90 minutes, while Roy and I watched the tree line and the creek ran below, and the May light came through the firs, in the slow way it comes when the canopy is still thin with new growth. She had her hands on her knees, and she did not fidget, and she did not speak. Roy and I did not speak much either. This is a thing you learn about the bench. Speech has a cost there, and after enough visits you stop paying it unless you have something to say. In the last 20 minutes before we started down, the musk came in from the south. I could see Brenda register it. The slight raise of her chin, the attention narrowing, and the birds stepped back from what they were doing the way they always did. And the presence was in the tree line, close enough that I thought it might come out to the bench the way it sometimes did. It did not come out, but it was there. Brenda sat very still through the last 20 minutes, both hands still on her knees, and when I said we should head back, she stood without comment and picked up her jacket and led the way to the trail. At the trailhead, she stood beside Roy's truck with her hands in her jacket pockets and looked up the drainage for a long time. Then she looked at me. Roy told me it positions itself between a person and the drop, she said. Yes, because it knows where the edge is. Yes. She looked up the drainage one more time. Then she said, okay, in the tone of someone who has accepted something they cannot argue with, and got in the truck. Roy's neurologist in Lewiston reclassified his condition in 2012 based on additional EEG data gathered over 3 years of monitoring. The initial diagnosis of idiopathic generalized epilepsy was revised to focal epilepsy with secondary generalization, evidence in the EEG suggesting the tonic-clonic events were originating from a specific region of the temporal lobe before spreading. It was a more precise diagnosis rather than a more serious one. The levetiracetam was adjusted, and he has been well controlled since. But the condition is permanent, and he knows it. And the way he moves through the backcountry reflects that knowledge. He hikes with a partner. He checks in by text at trailheads. He carries an identification card in his chest pocket that lists his diagnosis and his current medications and Brenda's phone number. He is the most careful man in the hills I know. I consider that a form of gratitude made practical. I retired from the Forest Service in 2018, 23 years after I started as a seasonal technician on the Bitterroot, and 9 years after a morning in September that I have never entered into any system. The Camera 7 station was decommissioned in 2016 when the monitoring program was consolidated due to budget constraints. The Fish Creek bench deemed peripheral to the primary wolf and elk corridors being tracked by the surviving stations. I collected the camera from the red cedar on my last official card pull that August, drove it home in the truck bed, and put it on the garage shelf next to the plaster casts. In the spring of 2014, my father had a stroke. He was in the house alone for an hour before a neighbor noticed his truck in the driveway. At a time of day it was usually not there, and knocked on the door and found him on the kitchen floor. He recovered well, some weakness on the left side that he mostly worked around, some word-finding difficulties that he mostly covered with silence, which was not much different from how he had always been. I transferred to the North Fork District and moved back to Kamaya to be closer to my parents, and my father and I never directly discussed the hour he was on the kitchen floor alone, because that is the kind of thing men in our family compress until it is small enough to carry without it showing. But I thought about it. The hour. What it is to be down and alone and to have the time pass with no one aware of where you are. I had been thinking about the Fish Creek frames since September of '08, and they had been significant to me in a professional way and in a human way, but after my father's stroke, they became something additional that I do not have a clean name for. The thing that came out of the tree line had known where Roy was. It had come anyway. It had stayed. Whatever it is that moves in a being when it chooses to go towards something hurt rather than away from it, I am a biologist, and I have no category for that, but I know my father was alone for an hour, and I know a man I had never met was alone on a bench above Fish Creek, and I know the outcomes were different, in ways that still make me go quiet when I think about them at the right time of day. I live in Kamaya now, in the house my parents owned. My mother is in assisted living in Lewiston, and I drive over twice a week to see her. My father died in 2020, the year the stroke finally compounded into something his heart could not manage. I have a blue heeler named Fletcher who is 12 years old and who came to me as a puppy when I was still on the North Fork District and who has been my primary company in the backcountry ever since. In September of 2019, I went up to the Fish Creek bench for the first time in 3 years. I had been going less frequently since moving back to Kamaya. The drive is longer from the new house, and Fletcher is old and does not love the steep sections the way he once did. But I wanted to go in September, 11 years after the morning I had loaded that SD card in the cold, and I wanted to go without a notebook or a camera or any of the apparatus of documentation. I left the day pack in the truck and walked up, with my hands in my jacket pockets and Fletcher walking beside me on his lead. The bench had not changed the way places change when you have been away for 3 years. It had changed the way places change when you have not been away at all, the kind of change that is just continuity proceeding without you. The lodgepole pine Roy had been leaning against in 2008 was bigger now, the bark rougher. The camera 7-seater was still standing with the weathered strap scar 40 inches up the trunk. The south edge of the bench still fell away to the creek below in the same way it always had. I sat on the log. Fletcher lay down at my feet with the deliberate collapse of an old dog who has done this many times in many places and has worked out that lying down is always preferable to standing if lying down is an option. The September light came through the fir canopy. The creek talked below the bench. An osprey went over at altitude, heading south, not paying us any attention. The musk came in about 40 minutes after I sat down. Fletcher's nose went up. He looked at the south tree line, and then he put his head back on my knee, and his tail moved twice, slowly, and that was all. 12 years. He has been up to the bench with me 4 times. He decided what he thought about the south tree line a long time ago, and his opinion has not changed. I sat with the presence the way I have been sitting with it for 11 years. The birds stepped back. The forest held itself in the particular way it holds itself. And I sat on the log on the bench above Fish Creek, and I thought about all the things that had not happened there. The institutions that had not come, the researchers who had not arrived, the reports that had not been written, and the systems that had not been filled, and the machinery of institutional response that had not been set in motion. I thought about frame 115 and the hand on the ground between Roy and the edge. I thought about Brenda in the Lewiston hospital holding my hand for an extra second before she let go. I thought about Carol Donaldson's mortality map and the 20% differential in the Fish Creek corridor and the elk calves that did not die in that drainage at the same rate as elk calves everywhere else on the Lochsa District. I thought about my father on the kitchen floor for an hour, and I thought about what it means for something to make a choice. Not a reflex, not an instinct, not the automatic calculus of an organism responding to stimulus. A choice to come out of the timber towards something hurt rather than away from it. To place a hand between a person and the edge. To stay. Fletcher sighed on my knee. The September light moved through the canopy. The creek kept on below the bench, working over the gravel the way it works over everything, slowly and without any concern for what we think about it. I do not know what lives in the Fish Creek corridor. I know what it has done. I know what it has chosen, repeatedly, over years, in ways that were not required of it and that benefited nothing except the specific humans who happened to be where it was. I know there are 4 notebooks in a box in my closet and 6 plaster casts on a shelf in my garage and a personal external drive in my desk drawer with 11 years of images on it that will never go into a system that would generate a key response I could not control and could not undo. I know Roy Galloway is healthy and careful and growing exceptional zucchini on 5 acres outside Kamaya and distributing the surplus to the food bank and to whoever else will take it. He calls twice a year, spring and fall like the elk seasons. He asks about my knees. I ask about the garden. We do not discuss what we both know about that bench above Fish Creek because there is nothing left to discuss. It is settled between us the way things settle when 2 people have sat in the same quiet for long enough. I know that one morning in September of 2008, a man collapsed alone on a trail in the Clearwater National Forest, 3 miles from the trailhead with nobody aware of where he was, and the only witnesses were a camera mounted to a cedar tree, and whatever came out of the tree line and chose to sit beside him. And I know that staying is a choice. That is the thing I have been carrying for 16 years, and the thing I wanted you to have, now that I have finally put it into words. Not what it is. Not what any of this means in any framework I was trained to use. Just that one fact, that when a man was on the ground, and the ground dropped away to the south of him, and there was no one else for 3 miles in any direction, something came out of the timber and sat beside him, and put its hand between him and the edge. It could have stayed in the trees. It had been in the trees all summer. It came out anyway. Fletcher put his head on my knee and his tail moved twice, and we sat there in the September morning, the 2 of us, in the light coming down through the firs and the sound of the creek below and the presence somewhere in the south tree line doing what it has always done, which is to be there. That is enough. That has always been enough.